My name is Ayesha. I am a psychiatrist working in Karachi, Pakistan. And about 10 days ago, we had this really interesting discussion with two fantastic, awesome women, Jo Miller, who is the CEO of Hud City, and Shirin Jawari, who is a triathlete, Iranian British triathlete based in London. And, we talked about how are women coming out of isolation, and also what is it that they do when they feel that things are beginning to feel a little bit out of control. And out of like about a good 45 to 50 minutes of discussion, there are some sort of key messages that came out as I was thinking through them, reading through them, reflecting through them, that I thought it would be wonderful to share with all of you. So perhaps the one that was the most interesting for me, because I hadn't really heard it just be said like that, was the sort of prospect of codifying. And one of our discussants, Jo Miller, mentioned how there are three things that really get to her, that really bother her, and she has a hard time dealing with them. One being gaslighting, the other being narcissism, and the third one being lying. And she then talked about how is it that she deals with those. And she used the word codifying, that she codifies them, which means that she breaks them down into a small digestible code, like action or thought, so that it's easier for her to process. So perhaps taking a deep breath at that time, or perhaps sort of realizing that with so much out of control, perhaps there is this one little thing that I can manage and I can try to control on my own. So breaking them into sort of smaller pieces and responding and letting your body and your mind respond in one small piece, so that it seems a little bit more acceptable and doable for you. Shirin, our athlete, was talking about how when the going gets tough and when things just seem like, this is it, am I going to lose my mind? The first thing that goes away is your sleep and your eating habits, or your healthy eating habits. You start stressing about things, you start sort of overthinking, you're lying in bed and you're unable to kind of, clear your mind and just go to sleep. So she talked about how important it is to make sure that you're mindful that my sleep's gone, or it's not as good or as restful as it's supposed to be. And then also, what are some of the other things that one can do to, understand and help us through that losing our sleep and losing our healthy eating habits. And she talked about connecting with nature, seeking nature, going out for walks, depending on where you are, making sure that you're connecting in some ways or the other with nature. Also exercising. So for some, it might be, going out for a run. Some it might be just doing yoga at home or meditating. But exercising was, one of the things that she said really helps with negative energy. Jo Miller talked about boxing, and she talked about how every morning she sort of just, in her home does a little bit of boxing to release that energy so that she's ready to start her day. So, the message that came out was that spare time is really sleeping time. So take care of your sleep. That came out that I had a lot of struggle with as I was starting my career, and perhaps it wasn't until like 2 to 3 years ago that I stopped doing it, was just saying yes to everything. So when you are someone who actually can do a lot of things well, a lot of prospects just seem very, very attractive, and you're like, wow, this is interesting. This is a great idea. And you start saying yes to them. And up to a certain point, it works out until you kind of find yourself being very spread thin. So again, becoming selective, realizing that what is it that you're doing that perhaps is now beginning to get a little bit tough on you, and figuring out a way to resist, kind of agreeing to everything that is coming your way or being posted your way. About how sometimes perfect becomes the enemy of good. Again, as we go through our life cycle, we just it probably comes inherently to a lot of us that we want everything to be perfect. It's a lot what we think about in our own minds as well, perhaps not what the input that we're getting from outside, but just an internal voice telling us that it has to be perfect, otherwise it's just not good enough. And the discussion really moved around how sometimes if you allow that to happen, then you're letting the good go by. So self-compassion, that's perhaps something that I talk about a lot as a psychiatrist as well. I've also been talking a lot about it during this whole pandemic, is really integral, very important. Being kind to yourself, showing compassion to yourself. And once you start doing that, you'll automatically realize that you'll start doing it to other people around you as well. Perhaps it's the need of the day as well as we go through this pandemic. So again, self-compassion, being kind to yourself, and being good enough sometimes is good enough. As we went through the discussion, something that came up which was very powerful was how we sometimes allow outside noises to distract us. There's just a lot goes on outside that may not really reflect and affect what we are doing, but it's just so loud that perhaps we get distracted and listen to that more than what is important for us. So I had just read an article about Ruth Ginsburg, where she had talked about how when she got married, her mother-in-law had told her that for successful marriages, it helps to be a little bit deaf. And she said how that also helped her in her workplace. And we talked a little bit about that, how is it that we can cloud out some of the noises. And when that conversation happened, Joe brought out a great point about how it's absolutely integral to blur out the noises, but it's also very, very important to hear the whispers and being very mindful to them. So that was, again, something very powerful that came up in our talk. As the conversation went further, I asked both Joe Miller and Shireen about how is it that they are able to focus on the big picture and not get caught into what's happening in that moment that seems like this is the be all end all, and the life will not go on again. And again, she's from her example of working in the area of physical exercise and athleticism, talked about how it's important to realize that no matter what's happening around the world, yes, it's a great pandemic that we are faced with at this point. The sun does rise in the morning. It does set at the end of the day. She talked about working in a farm where she got up in the morning, fed the animals, took them out, brought them back in, fed them again in the evening. And she was able to do that for about a couple of months. And regardless of what was happening around the world, that life went on. So perhaps realizing that this is, again, a small part of what we are doing. There is a larger perspective to the world. She also talked about, and this she brought up when we had earlier had our conversation before the event, that as a runner, there comes a point just before the finishing line where you've really exhausted all your physical energy. And when that happens, you tune into the emotional self and find that emotional energy that is able to bring a calm to your exhausted self and helps it really blur out everything else and focus just on that finishing line. So again, trying to get into that calmness, trying to, figure out where that calm is within you, and holding on to that as you cross that finishing line. We, concluded or, tried to wrap around our conversation, we talked about networks, because that is exactly what we were doing with this event. We were trying to bring together, tap into our networks to bringing some amazing women from all around the world to hear the three of us talking about how you come out of isolation, how do you get going when it's tough, but also hearing from them and what they were pitching in. And it came out that when we talk about networks, somehow it feels, starts to feel very political, that, oh, that you have to go out and network because it's the right thing to do. But really, it's about relationships. It's about, finding people that are perhaps going through the same kind of journey as you are at some point. It's about, finding out people where you could perhaps do some acts of kindness for them and they for you. So you forge these relationships with them. And that came out very, very strongly that, one of the ways when again, something like the pandemic happens or other, events in your life, when things don't look right, having that kind of network, having that kind of circle that you can tap into, that you can connect with, that is perhaps not part of your organization, but outside of it, so that it's not bearing heavy on you, which sometimes your networks within your own organization can, is exceedingly helpful and very comforting. So I think it's important that you have those anchor points outside of yourself, outside of your organization. And now, as we look at this whole global pandemic that has taken all of us in, having anchor points across the globe, because that really does bring us together as well. So I guess that is how we ended this conversation. And with this pandemic, as we look at what is it that we kind of think of, trying to get out of the situation and trying to make the best of the situation. Some of these things came out as key thoughts that perhaps all of us could tap into and help us get through difficult times.